The prairie does not care about your plans. It does not care about your age, your hopes, or the careful arrangements you made 3 weeks ago with a woman named Mrs. Dunmore, who smiled and shook your hand and said the room would be ready by the end of September. The prairie simply exists, flat and enormous and indifferent, stretching out in every direction until the sky has no choice but to come down and meet it. And in the autumn of 1876, in a small Dakota Territory town called Harwick, an 18-year-old girl named Celia Holt was about to learn that lesson in a way she would carry for the rest of her life. But before we go back to that September morning, we need to stop somewhere else first. We need to stop in the year 1944, in a small newspaper office in Harwick, where an editor named Gerald Foss sat reading a handwritten obituary submitted by the family of a woman who had just passed away at the age of 86. Gerald had been editing obituaries for 30 years. He thought he had read every kind of life a person could live in the Dakota Plains. He was wrong. He read the document once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on his desk, took off his glasses, and looked out the window at the main street of Harwick for a long moment. The obituary mentioned a marriage. It mentioned children and grandchildren and years of community service. It mentioned a woman who had outlived most of the people who had known her in her youth. But the part that stopped Gerald Foss, the part that made him set down his glasses, was a single paragraph near the middle of the page. It described a grain silo on the edge of town, a wooden cylinder that had stood on an abandoned plot of land since before most living residents could remember. And it said in plain, unadorned language that this silo had once saved the lives of 7 people during the worst blizzard Dakota Territory had ever recorded. Gerald picked up his pen and made a decision that day. He gave that silo half the column, because some stories are too important to summarize. This is one of them. Now we go back to September of 1876. Back to the morning Celia Holt turned 18 years old, and the world showed her exactly what it thought of a girl with no family, no money, and no place to go. The St. Bridget Home for Children sat at the north end of Harwick, like a building that had decided long ago to be practical rather than beautiful. It was 2 stories of pale timber, solid and functional, with small windows that let in just enough light to work by and just enough cold to remind you that comfort was not the point. For 11 years, it had been the only home Celia Holt had known. She had arrived at 7 years old with nothing but her mother's Bible and a name that the intake ledger spelled wrong. Celia, someone had written, and Sister Marin had scratched it out and corrected it with the careful, deliberate hand of a woman who believed that a person's name was the one thing that should always be gotten right. Sister Marin was not a soft woman. She was not the kind of nun who gathered children around her skirts and told them that God had a beautiful plan for each of them. She was practical and direct and sometimes sharp in a way that left a sting. But she was fair, and in the economy of an orphanage in 1876, fairness was worth more than warmth. Celia had understood that early, and she had respected Sister Marin for it, in the way that you respect a cold wind not because it feels good, but because it is honest. 11 years. Celia had spent 11 years inside those pale timber walls. She had washed floors and mended clothes and learned to read from a Bible. That was also the only object she owned that had belonged to her mother. She had watched other children get taken by distant relatives, by farming families who needed extra hands, by couples who came through Harwick and left with a smaller child on each arm. She had watched and waited and understood by the time she was 12 that no one was coming for her. She was not bitter about this. Bitterness requires energy, and in an orphanage, energy is a resource you spend carefully. What she had instead of bitterness was a plan. It was not a complicated plan. It was, in fact, the simplest plan available to a girl. In her situation, she would turn 18. She would take the $40 the home gave every departing orphan, and she would rent a room and find work and build something out of nothing the way people in Dakota Territory had always built things, by starting with whatever was already there and refusing to stop. She had been working toward this plan for 2 years. She had spoken to Mrs. Dunmore at the boarding house on Callaway Street. A coincidence of name, as it turned out, that she would think about later. And Mrs. Dunmore had looked her over and said there was a room available on the upper floor, $2 a month, and Celia could have it at the end of September. They had shaken hands. The room was hers. She had also spoken quietly to 3 families in town about laundry work. 2 had expressed interest. 1 had offered a firm yes, $2 a week to wash and fold and deliver. Celia had done the arithmetic at night by the light of a stub candle. $2 a week for laundry room at $2 a month. $40 in reserve. It was thin. It was very thin. But it was a foundation, and a foundation was all she needed. On the morning of her birthday, September 3rd, 1876, Sister Marin called her into the small wooden office at the end of the first-floor hallway. The room smelled of ink and beeswax and the particular dry cold of a building that had been heating itself against Dakota winters for 20 years. Sister Marin sat behind her desk with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something carefully neutral. Celia sat down across from her and waited. Sister Marin told her what she already knew, that 18 meant adulthood, and adulthood meant it was time to go. 2 weeks. She would need to be out by September 17th. She would receive the standard $40. She would receive the name of a woman in town who sometimes hired girls for domestic work, though Sister Marin was careful to note that the position was not guaranteed. She would also receive, though Sister Marin did not say this out loud, the complete and total removal of the only structure that had ever held her life in place. Celia nodded. She said she understood. She said she had already made arrangements. Sister Marin looked at her for a moment with something that might have been relief, or might have been the specific worry of a woman who knows the world better than the person sitting across from her. She said, "Good." She said she was glad to hear it. She said she hoped Celia would take care of herself. Celia walked out of the office and down the hall and out the front door into the September morning, and she breathed in the cool air that smelled of dry grass and distant wood smoke, and the particular metallic sharpness of a sky that was already beginning to think about winter. And she told herself that it was fine. The room was waiting. The work was arranged. The plan was in place. She went to Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house that afternoon to confirm the date of her arrival. The door was answered by Mrs. Dunmore's daughter, a young woman named Patrice, with her mother's sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she had rehearsed what she was about to say. She told Celia that she was sorry. But the room had been taken that morning. Someone had come by with the full month's payment in advance, and Mrs. Dunmore hadn't felt she could turn it down. She was very sorry. She hoped Celia would find something suitable. The door closed. Celia stood on the step for a moment. The street was quiet. A wagon passed slowly at the far end of the block. Somewhere behind her, a child called out, and another child answered. And then there was silence again. The cool September air pressed against her face and said nothing. She walked back toward street, Bridget slowly going over the arithmetic again in her head. $40, no room, 2 weeks, 3 possible laundry customers, 1 confirmed. The other boarding house in Harwick was on the far end of Marsh Street, and she had heard it was full through October. She had 2 weeks to find a room, or she would be standing on the street of this town with a Bible and a bag of clothes and no address in the world that belonged to her. She did not panic. Panic, like bitterness, was a resource she could not afford. But she walked a little faster than she had before. In the days that followed, Celia knocked on doors. She was methodical about it. She went street by street, starting from the center of Harwick and working outward the way a person searches for something lost, with discipline, not desperation. Because desperation makes you miss things. She asked at the hotel. Full, and the rates were impossible. She asked at the dry goods store whether the owner knew of any rooms for let. He mentioned a widow on Fenn Street, but warned her the woman was particular. She went to the widow on Fenn Street and found that particular was an understatement. The woman had a list of requirements that included a letter of character reference from a minister and proof of steady employment, neither of which Celia could produce in the next 14 days. She asked the laundry families she had spoken to. One offered a room in exchange for full-time domestic work, which meant no wages and no freedom, and essentially no difference from the life she had just left, except without Sister Marin's careful fairness to protect her. Another family said they would love to help, but their house was simply too small. A farmer 3 miles out of town offered her a room above his barn in exchange for helping with the animals each morning. 3 miles out, no transportation winter coming. She thanked each of them and went back to the street and kept walking. It was on the afternoon of September 9th, 6 days after her birthday, 8 days before she had to leave, that she found herself at the edge of town, at the place where the main street dissolved into dirt track, and the dirt track dissolved into open field. She had been walking for most of the day. Her feet ached. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon and casting long gold shadows across the grass, and the air had the particular sharpness of a September evening in Dakota, cool and clean, and faintly threatening like a letter that hasn't been opened yet. She was standing at the end of everything she could think of, and that was when she saw it. It rose out of the field about 300 yards off the main track on a plot of land that had clearly not been worked in some years. A tall wooden cylinder, maybe 30 feet high, maybe 20 feet across, with a pointed roof that had lost several shingles to the wind. The boards were weathered silver gray, the color of old bones. The loading door on the lower side hung slightly crooked on its hinges. The whole structure had the look of something that had been forgotten, set down in a field, and then abandoned when whoever set it there moved on to somewhere else. Celia stood and looked at it for a long moment. She could not have told you afterward what made her walk toward it. It was not logic. It was not a plan. It was something quieter than that, a pull the way you are pulled toward a door that is slightly open, in a room you have never entered, not because you know what is behind it, but because the opening itself is an invitation. She pushed through the tall grass and walked to it. The walls were thick, much thicker than she had expected. Standing up close, the pine planks stacked and fitted together with a care that suggested someone had built this to last, and not just to function. She put her hand against the wood and felt the solidity of it, the way it did not flex under pressure, the way it simply was. The crooked door opened with resistance, but it opened and she stepped inside. The echo of her footsteps was the first thing. The space amplified sound in a way that a square room never does. Her steps came back to her from the curved walls, soft and clean like the inside of a bell. The second thing was the light, thin strips of gold, where the setting sun found gaps between the planks, painting the interior in long, parallel lines of warmth. The third thing was the space itself. It was enormous. She had been thinking in terms of a room. A small room, something to put a bed and a trunk in, something to put a roof over her head with. This was not a room. This was a chamber. A tall, circular chamber with a dirt floor and a timber ceiling 30 feet overhead, and enough space to fit 4 rooms inside it with room left over. The curved walls went up, and at the top, the pointed roof came to a peak, and the whole interior smelled of old grain and dry wood, and something faint and mineral that she would later identify as the smell of the Dakota wind itself, pressed into the boards over years of battering. She stood in the center of the floor and looked up, and something happened that she would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked, though she would think about it for the rest of her life. Standing in that hollow wooden cylinder on a dying September afternoon with 8 days until she had no place to sleep, she felt for the first time since the door of the boarding house had closed in her face something that was not quite hope, but was the shape of it, the outline. A roof was a roof, and this one was free, or at least it might be. If she could find out who it belonged to, if they would hear her out, if they would say yes. She walked back to town in the gathering dark, working out what she needed to do next. The Harwick Land Office was a single room off the main street, run by a man named Court Bellamy, who wore the same brown vest every day and kept records with a precision that suggested he understood that property was the closest thing to permanence that Dakota Territory had to offer. Celia went there the morning of September 10th before the office was properly open, and waited on the step until Bellamy arrived with his key. She asked him who owned the abandoned plot on the east track, the one with the old grain silo. He looked it up without expression. The land and the structure on it were registered to a man named Harlan Briggs of Fargo. He had acquired the property 8 years ago as part of a larger land transaction and had done nothing with it since. Celia asked if Bellamy had an address. He gave her the post office box. She went back to street, Bridget's, and sat at the table in the common room with a piece of paper and a pen, and Sister Marin's inkwell, which Sister Marin lent her, without asking why. She wrote the letter carefully, revising it 3 times in her head, before she put the first word on the page, because she understood that the letter had to accomplish several things at once. It had to explain her situation clearly without sounding like a plea. because a plea is easy to refuse. It had to describe what she was asking for in terms that made it reasonable. And it had to offer something in return, because people who are asked for something with nothing offered back have no reason to say yes. She told Harlan Briggs that she was 18 years old and had just left the St. Bridget Home for Children in Harwick. She told him she had been unable to secure lodging in town for the coming winter. She told him she had located his grain silo on the East Track plot and found it structurally sound, and that she was writing to ask his permission to occupy it through the winter months, in exchange for maintaining it in good condition and protecting it from any interference. That last phrase, protecting it from any interference, came to her at the last moment when she was reading the letter over for the final time. She added it on instinct. She was not yet sure why. She mailed it that afternoon. Then she waited. She waited with more fear than she allowed herself to show, because she had nothing else. No backup arrangement, no second plan, no friendly relative who might take her in. She had St. Bridget's until September 17th, and then she had the $40 and the Dakota Sky and whatever Harlan Briggs decided to do with his abandoned silo. The reply arrived on September 15th, 2 days before she had to leave. She recognized the Fargo postmark before she even opened it. She sat down on the front step of St. Bridget's and opened the envelope with hands that were steadier than she expected. And she read what Harlan Briggs had written. And then she read it again. He had written, "Permission granted. The structure is yours to occupy through the spring thaw, provided you maintain the exterior and prevent any unauthorized removal of materials from the property. There is a party in Harwick who has expressed interest in purchasing the silo timber. I have refused him. I expect you to ensure the structure remains intact until I can make alternative arrangements." And then, in smaller writing at the bottom as if it were an afterthought, the silo was built by a German settler named Wilhelm Frisch in 1859. He knew what he was doing. You'll be warmer than you expect. Celia read the letter a third time. Then she sat on the step for another minute holding the paper in both hands. And she did something she had not done in a very long time. She let herself feel the thing she was actually feeling. Relief. Pure, flooding, undignified relief. The kind that comes not when a good thing happens, but when a catastrophe does not. The kind that makes your hands shake and your eyes fill and your chest expand all at once. She sat on the step of the orphanage where she had spent 11 years of her life, 2 days before she had to leave it forever, and she let the relief move through her. And then she folded the letter carefully and put it inside her mother's Bible and went back inside to prepare. She also paused for a moment over the phrase, "a party in Harwick who has expressed interest in purchasing the silo timber." She knew without knowing how she knew exactly who that party was. There was a name in Harwick that carried weight. It did not carry it loudly the way some names do. It did not announce itself in a raised voice or a flashy display. It carried weight the way a stone carries weight, quietly, constantly, and with the specific gravity of something that has been in one place for a long time. Raymond Aldrich. He had come to Harwick 12 years ago with capital and connections, and a talent for acquiring things that other people undervalued. He owned 3 buildings on the main street and a significant portion of the land on the western edge of town. He employed more people in Harwick than any other single person. He was not cruel exactly. Cruelty implies a kind of passion. And Raymond Aldrich was not a passionate man. He was precise. He identified what he wanted, determined the most efficient way to obtain it, and obtained it with the minimum of friction and the maximum of calculation. He was 51 years old. He had a wife named Harriet, whom he had married for her father's connections, and who had turned out to be a more capable woman than he had anticipated, which he considered a reasonable bonus. He had 2 children. He had a large cabin on the northern edge of town, with a wide, flat roof that his builder had assured him was the finest construction in Dakota Territory. He had also, in the first week of September, 1876, made a quiet arrangement with Mrs. Dunmore of the boarding house on Callaway Street. He had not done it out of malice toward Celia Holt specifically. He had done it because he was in the process of negotiating the purchase of Harlan Briggs's silo timber good pine, structurally sound, exactly what he needed for a warehouse addition. He was planning, and he did not want the complication of a sitting occupant creating legal or social difficulties with the transaction. He had not known Celia Holt from any other orphan in the territory. He had simply been told by a reliable source that the girl was likely to approach Mrs. Dunmore about a room, and it had been a simple matter to make it worth Mrs. Dunmore's while to say the room was taken. It was the kind of small, clean interference that Raymond Aldrich made without losing sleep over it. He had not thought about it again. Celia did not know any of this when she walked through Harwick that September week knocking on doors. She did not know that the outcome of each conversation had been left to ordinary human fortune and ordinary human failure, that the widow on Fenn Street was simply difficult, that the farmer's room above the barn was simply inadequate, that the boarding house on the far side of Marsh Street was simply full. She did not know that one of those outcomes had been shaped before she arrived. She found out in small pieces much later, and by that time the story had already ended in a way that Raymond Aldrich had not planned for. Thomas Voss was 24 years old and built like someone who had spent his entire life doing things with his hands which he had. He and his younger brother Henrik had come from Wisconsin 2 years ago with a set of carpentry tools, a willingness to work in weather that discouraged lesser men, and a combined cheerfulness that local residents had initially found suspicious and eventually found indispensable. Thomas was the quiet one. Henrik talked enough for both of them, which suited Thomas, who preferred to use words the way he used nails only when the work required it, and always in exactly the right place. Celia found them through a man at the hardware store, who said they were the best builders in Harwick, and the only ones who would take a 3-day job on 2 days' notice. She met them at the silo on the morning of September 14th. 3 days before she had to move in. She explained what she needed: a wooden floor above the cold ground, a sleeping loft above that, a stove installation with proper pipe-sealed walls, and a repaired roof. Henrik looked at the silo with the eyes of someone rapidly calculating materials and labor. He said they could do it. He said it would be close. He said it would cost $8. Celia said $8 was fine. Thomas walked slowly around the interior, his hand trailing along the curved wall, stopping at each section to press his thumb into the wood, testing for rot, for weakness, for any place where the structure was less than what it appeared. He went around the entire circumference twice before he spoke. When he did, he spoke to Henrik, but he looked at Celia. He said, This is Frisch work." Henrik looked up from his notepad. Wilhelm Frisch, the man who had the farm out on the eastern... Same. Thomas pressed his palm flat against the wall. "Look at the thickness, and the iron rings, you see them every 4 feet going up. That's not standard construction. He built this to take something. Wind, most likely. He knew what was coming in from the northwest." Celia looked at the iron rings she had not noticed before, set into the wood at regular intervals all the way up the interior wall, connecting the planks in a continuous circular brace. They were slightly rusty, but solid. They were, she understood, the reason the silo had been standing in an open field for 17 years without anyone maintaining it. Thomas turned to her finally and said, "You didn't just find an old building. You found one of the only structures in Harwick County that was designed for this weather." He said it plainly, without emphasis, the way you state a fact. But Celia heard something underneath the plainness that she had not heard directed at her in recent memory. He was not telling her she had been lucky. He was telling her that she had recognized something that other people had walked past without seeing. He went back to examining the wall. Henrik went back to his notepad, and Celia stood in the center of the silo floor in the long morning light and felt for the first time in a week something other than the pressure of the thing she needed to solve. They worked from sunrise to well past dark over the following 3 days. Henrik was constant motion, measuring, cutting, fitting, hammering, a running commentary of observations and calculations that seemed to be addressed to no one in particular, and everyone at once. Thomas worked in silence, but with a precision that was almost beautiful to watch. The way someone playing a difficult piece of music well is beautiful to watch, not because of the effort, but because of the complete absence of wasted motion. They built the floor first, thick planks laid 6 inches above the dirt, nailed to a frame of crossbeams that distributed the weight evenly around the circumference. Then, the loft, a second level halfway up the silo, accessible by a short ladder with a railing along the open edge, and enough headroom to sit up, and nearly enough to stand. They cut the stovepipe hole in the wall with careful geometry, set 3 flat stones beneath the iron stove Celia purchased from the hardware man for $3, and ran the pipe up and out at an angle that would draw properly. The walls they sealed with moss and a mixture of clay and animal fat that Henrik produced from a pouch in his pack, pressing it into every gap and crack with a flat tool until the interior was as windproof as the materials could make it. The roof they patched with cedar shakes salvaged from an abandoned barn half a mile away. Henrik on the ladder and Thomas on the peak, both of them working in the last light of September evenings, while the sky went from gold to green to deep violet, and the temperature dropped fast, the way Dakota temperatures do in September. Not gradually, but suddenly, like a door slamming shut. On the afternoon of September 16th, the last full day of work, Thomas came down from the roof and walked through the interior slowly, the way he had done the first morning. He checked the stovepipe, pressed his hand along the sealed walls, climbed to the loft and came back down. He looked at the floor, the loft, the iron rings in the wall, the patched roof overhead. Then he turned to Celia, who was standing near the stove watching him. He said, "It'll hold." 2 words, She had learned in 3 days that when Thomas Voss said 2 words, he meant what he would have taken 20 to say if he were another man. She thanked them both. She paid them the $8. Henrik shook her hand vigorously and said she was the most practical person he had met in Dakota Territory, which, coming from Henrik, she understood to be the highest possible compliment. Thomas put his tools in his bag and picked up his coat and started for the door, and then stopped. He turned back and looked at the northwest corner of the interior, the place where the wind would hit hardest, the place where cold would find its way in first. He pulled 3 nails from his coat pocket and a small hammer from his belt, and spent 4 minutes tightening the iron ring at that corner, working the nail heads into the wood until the ring sat flush and solid and perfectly set. Then he put the hammer back and walked out without saying anything. Celia watched him go. She stood alone in the silo for a moment, listening to the evening wind begin to move against the outside of the curved walls, listening to the sound it made, which was not the sound of something being battered, but the sound of something being redirected. The wind sliding around the cylinder, the way water slides around a stone in a river, finding no flat surface to push against, finding nothing to hold. She thought about Harlan Briggs' letter, "You'll be warmer than you expect." She thought about what Thomas had said, "You didn't just find an old building." She went back to St. Bridget's and slept her last night in the room she had shared with 4 other girls for 11 years. And in the morning she picked up her 2 dresses, her blanket, her mother's Bible, and the small amount of money she had left after the stove and the labor and the supplies, and she walked to the silo and stepped inside. The door closed behind her. The curved walls stood on every side. The new floor was solid under her feet. The stove sat cold and ready in the center of the space waiting to be lit. Above her, the loft was a dark shelf against the interior, and above that, the roof sealed everything in. And somewhere above that, the October sky was already beginning to build its winter argument. There was no bell. There would be no bell. No one to tell her when to rise, when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. The silence that pressed in around her from the curved walls was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of an open question. She set her things down on the new floor. She took out her mother's Bible and set it on the small shelf Thomas had nailed to the wall, without being asked to at exactly the right height for a person to reach from a sitting position. She found the tin of matches in her coat pocket and opened the stove and built a careful, economical fire, the way you build a fire when the wood has to last. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the curved wall, and her knees drawn up and her hands folded, and her eyes open, and she listened to the fire begin to breathe, and the wind move around the outside of the silo, and the vast, indifferent prairie settle into the early dark. She thought about the plan. The plan had broken. The plan had been broken by someone she did not yet know the full shape of, in a way she could not yet see clearly. But she was here. She was inside 4 walls. The walls were standing, and somewhere in the distance Harwick went about its evening business, lit its lamps, set its tables, and did not think once about the girl in the silo. That was all right. They would think about her later. She was 18 years old. She had survived everything that had tried to take her down before she could begin. She had a roof and a stove and a mother's Bible and $8 left, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't come from anger but from something quieter and more permanent. The simple refusal installed somewhere deep in the architecture of who she was, to stop. Outside, the wind moved around the cylinder and went on past. It found nothing to hold on to. The silo held. And so did Celia Holt. October came to Harwick the way it always did in Dakota Territory, not gradually, not with the slow, golden descent that people in gentler climates associate with autumn, but decisively like a hand placed flat on the table at the end of a negotiation. One morning the air smelled of dry grass and fading warmth. The next morning it smelled of iron and distance and the particular cold that has no single source, that comes not from the north or the west, but from everywhere at once, as if the sky itself had changed its mind about the season and saw no reason to apologize for it. Celia noticed it the way she noticed everything now, practically with the specific attention of someone who understands that the difference between observation and survival is often just a matter of timing. She had been in the silo for 2 weeks by the time October arrived. In those 2 weeks, she had learned things about her shelter that no one could have told her in advance, things that only become apparent when you live inside a structure through a range of weather, rather than simply inspecting it on a calm afternoon. She had learned that the curved walls created a particular quality of warmth when the stove was lit. Not the radiant warmth of a square room where heat bounces from flat surface to flat surface, but something more, even more distributed, as if the cylinder gathered heat. The way it gathered sound, amplifying it and sending it back from every direction at once. She had learned that the loft Thomas had built was warmer than the floor level by several degrees, and that sleeping there on cold nights was the difference between waking stiff and waking rested. She had learned that the northwest corner where Thomas had tightened the iron ring on the last afternoon was the wall that took the most pressure from the wind, and that the sound, it made a low, sustained hum, rather than the rattling and cracking you heard. In frame houses was the sound of something absorbing force, rather than resisting it. She had also learned that the silo was too large to heat entirely, and that trying to heat it entirely was a waste of wood she could not afford. So she did what practical people do when the problem is larger than the solution. She made the problem smaller. She hung 4 heavy wool blankets on a rope she strung across the interior, at a distance of about 12 feet from the stove, creating an inner room within the outer structure, a circle of warmth inside the circle of walls. It was not elegant. It was not comfortable in any way that the word comfortable is usually meant. But it was effective, and in Dakota Territory in October, effective was the only measurement that mattered. She had also, in those first 2 weeks, found her footing with the work. She had secured 3 laundry customers in the first week, adding to the 1 family she had already confirmed before leaving St. Bridget's. By the end of the second week, she had 7. By the middle of October, she had 10, which brought her income to $16 a month. Thin as she had always known it would be, but enough. Enough to buy wood. Enough to buy the simple food she needed. Enough to rebuild the small reserve she had spent on the stove and the construction materials dollar by dollar, week by week. With the patience of someone who has learned that small amounts accumulated over time are the only kind of wealth available to people who start with nothing. The work was hard. in the way that physical labor in cold weather is always hard. The hands cracking, the shoulders aching, the constant fight to keep water at the right temperature when the air outside is trying to freeze everything that isn't moving. She walked a mile into Harwick each morning and a mile back each evening, carrying loads of laundry in both directions. And she did it in the increasing cold of October mornings with the particular expression of someone who has decided that complaining about the weather is a luxury she cannot currently afford. The people of Harwick watched her with varying degrees of interest and judgment. Some of them admired what she was doing, or at least respected it, in the guarded, practical way that Dakota settlers respected anything that demonstrated competence in the face of difficulty. A few of her laundry customers were quietly kind, leaving extra wood on the step when they knew she had to carry it home, or adding a piece of cornbread to the payment. Without comment, the small, anonymous generosities of people who have enough to share one small thing at a time. Others watch with a different kind of attention, the kind that waits for failure the way some people wait for weather, not impatiently, but with a settled certainty that it is coming and that when it arrives, the waiting will have been justified. She heard in fragments and second-hand what was being said. She heard the word foolish applied to her situation. She heard the word sad. She heard once from a woman at the dry goods counter who had not seen Celia come in through the side door. The phrase living like an animal in a grain bin, delivered with the cheerful authority of someone who considers herself a reliable narrator of other people's choices. Celia bought her flour and went home. She was not indifferent to what was being said. She was not the kind of person who achieves peace through not caring. She cared in the way that all people care, when they understand that the opinions of a community have practical consequences, that a woman who is talked about as foolish will find certain doors harder to open, certain conversations harder to have. But she had made a calculation early on that the only response to that kind of talk, which would eventually mean anything, was the response she gave every day by simply continuing, by being there in the morning and being there at night, by building the fire and carrying the laundry and writing in her small notebook, and sleeping in the loft and getting up again. The notebook had become something she had not planned for it to be. She had started it as a practical record, a place to track what she spent and what she earned, to note which gaps in the silo wall let in the most cold, to mark the direction of the wind on different days, and the effect it had on the stove's draw. But as October wore on and the cold deepened, and the days shortened, the notebook grew into something more. She began sketching the interior of the silo from different angles, noting where the iron rings sat in the wall, and at what intervals diagramming the way the floor frame distributed weight around the circumference. She wrote observations about how the curved wall handled wind differently on different sides and at different heights. She had no technical education. She had no framework for what she was observing beyond the framework of someone paying very close attention to something they need to understand in order to survive. She did not think of it as engineering. She thought of it as knowing where she lived. Thomas Voss came back on a Tuesday in late October, in the way that he did most things, without announcement and without particular ceremony, simply appearing at the silo door with his coat collar up against the wind and a small crate of cedar shims under his arm that he said were for the roof, which had developed a minor leak over the northwest section after a hard rain. He went up to the roof and fixed the leak. He came back down and checked the stovepipe draw and found it slightly restricted and adjusted it. He inspected the iron ring he had tightened on the last day in September and found it still solid. He was methodical and quiet and completely focused on the work the way he always was, and when he finished, he stood in the middle of the silo floor and looked around with the assessing eye of someone checking a piece of work they are responsible for. Celia offered him coffee from the small pot she kept on the edge of the stove. He accepted it and sat on the floor with his back against the wall. And that was when he saw the notebook. It was open on the shelf near the Bible, showing a diagram she had made that morning of the interior wall structure, with notes in her small, precise handwriting about the spacing of the iron rings, and a question she had written in the margin. Does the ring spacing match the height at which wind pressure increases? Thomas picked it up carefully as people pick up things that belong to others and read the page. Then he turned back and read the 2 pages before it. He set it down and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. He said, "You're solving it like an engineer." Not asking, stating. Celia said she was just writing down what she noticed. He said, "That's what engineers do." He finished his coffee and set the cup on the shelf and stood up and put on his coat. He picked up the empty crate and walked to the door, and then he paused, which was a thing she had already learned to pay attention to when Thomas Voss did it, because a pause from Thomas meant something was being considered that was worth considering. He said without turning around, "The northwest ring, the one at the 12-foot level. Check it after the next hard wind. If it shifts even a fraction, add a second nail on the east side of the bracket." He went out. She heard his footsteps in the frozen grass, and then she did not hear them. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the door. She picked up her pen and wrote in the margin next to her question about the wind pressure check ring at 12 feet after hard wind. East side of bracket if shift. Then she sat for a moment and felt something she recognized, though she had not felt it often enough to have a name for it yet. Something that lives in the space between being seen and being understood. Something that is closer to being taken seriously than to being liked, and is in many ways more valuable. She went back to work. November brought the first real snow, and with it the first real test of everything Celia had built and sealed and braced and prepared for. It came on a Thursday evening, starting as the fine, dry snow that Dakota people call ground drift snow, that doesn't fall so much as move horizontally, driven by a wind that seems less interested in the sky than in the earth. By midnight, it had deepened into something more substantial, 6 inches by morning, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of number that makes outdoor work an act of deliberate will, rather than routine habit. Celia woke in the loft to a sound she had not heard before, or rather to the absence of a sound she had come to expect. The wind, which over the past weeks had established a constant low pressure against the northwest wall, was gone. The silo was completely silent. She lay still for a moment and listened to the silence, and understood in the way that you understand things before you have words for them that the silence was not peace. It was the silence of something being held, the silence of a breath drawn in and not yet released. She got up and dressed in the cold, and went down the ladder and opened the door against the resistance of the snow that had drifted against the base, and looked out at a world that had gone entirely white. The snow had stopped. The wind had stopped. The sky was the flat, expressionless gray of hammered tin. 300 yards away in the direction of Harwick, she could make out the dark shapes of buildings. and she could see even at that distance that the roof of the small cabin directly north of the main track, a family named Cutter, she believed, was missing several shingles that had not been missing the evening before. She looked at the silo roof. It was intact. She looked at the silo walls. Not one board had moved. She went back inside, built up the fire, and made her notes. It was this incident, the November snow, the shingles, the silo standing unmarked, that Walter Crane came to see her about. Walter Crane was 63 years old, a man made of dimensions that suited his profession, wide in the shoulders, deep in the chest, with hands that looked less like hands than like tools that had been given hands as a secondary function. He had been building and repairing structures in Harwick County for 40 years, which meant that he had watched more things fall down in bad weather than most engineers would see in 3 careers, and that he had strong opinions about why they fell. He came to the silo on a cold Friday morning 3 days after the November snow, walking out from town along the east track with the deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where he is going and has thought about it long enough that there is no need to hurry. He knocked on the door. Celia opened it. He introduced himself with the directness of someone who does not consider small talk a necessary precondition to conversation. He said he had heard about the silo, heard about the girl living in it, and heard about the Cutter family's missing shingles, and heard that this structure had come through the same weather without a mark, and that he had come to look at it himself, because in 40 years of building in Dakota Territory, he had developed the opinion that when something survives what its neighbors do not, there is always a reason, and finding the reason is worth the walk. Celia stepped back and let him in. He spent 20 minutes going over the interior the way Thomas had done in September, but with a different vocabulary of attention. Thomas had looked with the eyes of a carpenter, checking his own work, but Walter Crane looked with the eyes of someone reading a document written in a language he has spent his life learning to understand. He ran his hands along the wall. He examined the iron rings. He looked at the floor frame, the stovepipe angle, the patched roof overhead. He went to the northwest corner and pressed his thumb into the wood at each level, counting the rings as he went up. Then he stood in the center of the floor and looked at the curved wall for a long moment. He said, "Flat walls fight the wind. Round walls outlast it." He said it the way people say things they have been thinking for a long time, without having the occasion to say out loud. Not as a discovery, but as a confirmation. Celia said she had noticed that the wind seemed to slide around rather than push through. Walter looked at her. He said, "That's exactly what it does." He paused. "You've been writing that down." She showed him the notebook. He read it the way Thomas had read it, carefully, going back to reread things, his expression shifting from neutral interest to something more concentrated. The expression of someone who is recognizing in an unexpected place a pattern of thinking that they respect. He handed it back. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "After this winter, there are going to be people in this county who want to know how to build something that doesn't fall down in a storm. When that time comes, that notebook is going to matter." Celia looked at him. She said she hadn't thought of it that way. Walter Crane put on his hat and walked to the door, and then stopped with his hand on the frame in the same way Thomas had stopped on the last day of construction. and she thought these men who are good at what they do, they all pause at the same moment. The moment when the thing they are thinking catches up with the thing they are about to do. He said, "The man who wants to buy this timber. You know who it is." She said she had a strong suspicion. He said, "Aldrich won't stop wanting what Aldrich wants just because a letter from Fargo says no. Keep the letter somewhere it won't burn." He looked at the silo walls. "Keep everything you've built." Then he walked back to town along the frozen east track, his wide shoulders steady against the December wind, and Celia stood in the doorway and watched him go, and then went inside and moved Harlan Briggs' letter from inside the Bible cover to a tin box she kept under the floorboard near the stove. She also that afternoon began a new section in the notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote structural observations wall performance under wind load, and she began to fill it in. The thing about Raymond Aldrich was that he did not operate through loudness. A loud man makes threats you can hear and prepare for. Raymond Aldrich operated through the kind of quiet, systematic pressure that you only recognize as pressure when you look back at the shape it has left. In November, 2 of Celia's laundry customers canceled without explanation. Mrs. Hatcher sent her daughter to the door to say they had decided to manage their own laundry through the winter. The Belfort family left a note on the doorstep. Not even at the laundry exchange point just dropped in the frost-stiff grass near the path. It said only that they would not be requiring the service going forward. Celia did the arithmetic. 2 customers at $2 each was $4 a month, which dropped her income from $16 to $12, which made the margin between functional and desperate significantly narrower. She went back to the laundry families she still had and asked each of them as directly as she could, without accusation, whether they were still satisfied with the work. Every one of them said yes. And then the woman at the third house, a woman named Nell Garrett, who was probably 40 and had the kind of face that has decided to stop softening things, said something that the others had only implied. She said that Raymond Aldrich had been talking to people, that he had said something to the effect that patronizing the orphan girl's laundry business was the kind of thing that reflected poorly on a family of standing, that a few people had decided it wasn't worth the social cost. Celia thanked her. Nell Garrett said, "I don't take instruction from Raymond Aldrich on how to manage my household. And I'm not the only one." She paused. "I'll pay you an extra quarter a week starting next month. Not charity. Your work is worth more than I've been paying." Celia walked back to the silo that evening in the early dark of December, with the cold pressing against her face from every direction, and she thought about what Raymond Aldrich was doing and why and what it meant. He had not taken the silo timber. He had not found a legal way around Harlan Briggs's letter. He could not remove her physically without exposing himself to consequences he was too careful to risk. So he was doing the thing that careful, powerful men do when direct action is not available. He was making her environment smaller. He was trimming the edges of her life one small cut at a time, hoping to make the sum of small losses add up to a defeat he could not accomplish directly. She thought about this for a long time that night, sitting in front of the stove with the notebook in her lap. Then she opened to a blank page and began to write down the names of everyone she had spoken to about laundry work in the first week of September. including the families she had not yet secured as customers. She had been focused on maintaining the customers she had. She had not been thinking about growing. Raymond Aldrich's interference had not occurred to her as something that could be responded to by expansion. She thought about it now. By the end of December, she had 12 laundry customers. Her income had grown to $19 a month. She had replaced what Aldrich had taken and added 3 more, working not by confronting what had been done to her, but by making the territory of her life large enough that the trimming of its edges became irrelevant. She did not write any of this down in the notebook in triumphant terms. She just recorded the numbers. The numbers were enough. December in Dakota Territory is not a season so much as an argument that the world makes about what is and is not sustainable. The cold does not simply arrive, it makes a case day after day in temperatures that drop below zero and stay there in winds that find every gap in every wall and remind every person on the plains that the structures between them and the weather are the only things standing between survival and its absence. Inside the silo, Celia had refined her system to a precision she was quietly proud of. The wool blankets created a heated interior chamber that the small stove could maintain at a livable temperature with a reasonable amount of wood. The loft stayed warm enough at night that she slept without waking from cold, which was more than many people in Harwick could say she heard in the course of her laundry rounds about families who woke to find frost inside their windows and water frozen in pots left beside the hearth. She had also by December developed a relationship with the silo's particular language, the sounds it made in different weather, the way the hum in the northwest wall changed pitch as the wind's intensity changed the slight additional stress she could feel in the floor frame. On the coldest mornings, the way the stovepipe drew better, or worse depending on the temperature. Differential between inside and outside. She knew the building the way you know. A person you have lived closely with, not by description, but by the texture of their presence, the subtle communication of their moods. She also knew by December that Thomas Voss came by more often than the maintenance of the structure strictly required. He came on the pretext of the stovepipe, which did occasionally need adjustment. He came on the pretext of the roof, though. The cedar patches had held solidly through 2 significant snows. He came once with a length of extra rope he said would be useful for the blanket frame, which it was, and once with information about a family near the edge of town who was looking for laundry help, which was also useful. He stayed each time for longer than the stated purpose of the visit required. He drank the coffee she offered. He read whatever page of the notebook happened to be open. He made observations, quiet, precise, always useful, and then put his coat on and walked back to Harwick. Henrik, who came along on 2 of these visits, and had the gift of saying clearly what was obvious to everyone except the people most directly involved, told Celia on his second visit that his brother had talked about the silo notebook on 3 separate occasions in the preceding 2 weeks, which was 3 more times than Thomas typically talked about anything. Celia said that was interesting and went back to folding laundry. Henrik smiled and did not press the point. He understood that some things proceed at their own pace. January arrived with a cold that was different in character from December's. Cold heavier, more settled, the cold of something that has been building for a long time and has finally decided it does not need to hurry anymore because it has already won. The temperature on the first morning of January was 15 below zero. By the fourth, it had risen to 0, which people in Harwick discussed as a relative improvement. By the seventh, it had dropped again to 10 below, and the sky had taken on the particular quality of light that experienced prairie residents learned to recognize and take seriously. A flat, metallic brightness that is not the brightness of sun, but of ice crystals suspended in the upper air, refracting a light that comes from everywhere and nowhere and casts no shadows. On the evening of January the 7th, Celia walked her laundry route and returned to the silo as the last light was fading, and she stood outside the door for a moment before going in. She stood and listened. The prairie was silent, not the ordinary silence of a cold evening when sound simply carries less and the day's activity has wound down. This was a different kind of silence, complete, total, and somehow pressurized the silence of a great deal of air, holding itself very still. The few birds that wintered in the area were not calling. The distant cattle that she sometimes heard from the farms to the east were not audible. Even the wind, which in 7 weeks she had never known to stop entirely, had ceased. The air was absolutely still. She looked at the sky to the northwest. It was the color of a cast-iron skillet, not gray, not blue, but a dark metallic tone that seemed to come from inside the clouds, rather than from the sky behind them. The horizon in that direction had a greenish quality at the very edge, a faint, sickly tint that she had never seen before. Sister Maren had taught her many things in 11 years, most of them practical, some of them unexpected. One of the things she had taught her on a winter afternoon years ago, when Celia had asked why Sister Maren always looked at the sky to the northwest. Before closing the shutters was this: when the prairie holds its breath, step back. It is not resting. It is preparing. Celia went inside and she did not remove her coat. She went to the wood pile in the corner of the heated interior and counted what she had. She had enough for 3 days of normal burning. She needed more. She spent the next 2 hours making 4 trips to the woodpile she kept outside the silo door, moving wood inside until she had 10 days' worth stacked against the inner wall. She filled every bucket and pot she owned with water from the barrel at the silo's base. She went around the interior and checked every sealed gap in the walls, pressing her fingers into the moss and clay packing at every joint, finding 2 places where the packing had contracted slightly in the cold, and pressing new material in from a bag she kept for the purpose. She checked the iron ring in the northwest wall at the 12-foot level, the way Thomas had told her to check it. It was solid. She climbed to the loft and brought every blanket down to the heated interior and distributed them in a way that would allow the most efficient warming of the most people in a space configured for the maximum retention of body heat. She had not thought consciously about why she was configuring the space for multiple people. She had not told herself she was expecting anyone. She had simply done it the way the body sometimes knows what the mind has not yet admitted. Then she sat by the stove and she listened to the silence outside the curved walls. And she waited. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the temperature dropped from 0 degrees to 20 below in less than an hour. She heard it before she felt it, a sound like the air itself being struck a deep, resonant concussion that was not quite a sound but was felt in the chest and the ears simultaneously. And then the wind came. not gradually, not building from a breeze to a gust, to a sustained blow. All at once, at full force, a wall of moving air that struck the silo from the northwest with a single percussive impact, and then settled into a sustained roar that was not like any wind she had heard before, not the variable, gusting wind of ordinary storms. This was continuous, constant, a single sustained note from a force that had no intention of pausing. The silo shuddered. Once, just once, as the first impact struck. The floor trembled underfoot. The blankets swayed on their rope. The stovepipe pinged once with the change in pressure. And then everything steadied. The curved walls took the force of the wind and did what curved walls do not. Resisted but redirected, sending the pressure sliding around the circumference, distributing it across the whole structure so that no single point bore more than its share. The sound inside the silo was loud, but not violent. It was the sound of something being managed rather than something being endured. Celia added wood to the stove and turned up the wick of her lamp. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date January 8th, 1877, and the time and a single observation temperature drop, approximately 20 degrees in 1 hour. Wind from northwest, continuous unlike any previous storm. Silo holding. Then she closed the notebook and set it on the shelf and sat down on the floor, with her back against the south wall as far from the door as she could get. And she clasped her hands together in her lap. And she waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. She was about to find out. At 9 o'clock in the evening, over the continuous roar of the blizzard that was tearing across the Dakota prairie and destroying everything in its path, that had been built without thought for what it would someday face, there came a sound at the door of the silo. A knocking. Celia lifted her head. She looked at the door. She waited, thinking she had imagined it, that the wind had found some loose piece of timber outside and was beating it against the structure, that what she had heard was not intention, but accident. The knocking came again. 3 blows, deliberate, unmistakable, the rhythm of a human hand. She was on her feet and at the door before she had consciously decided to move. She lifted the crossbar and braced her shoulder against the door and pushed against the wind, which pushed back with an authority that made opening it feel like an argument rather than a simple mechanical action. The door opened 6 inches, then 12. The wind screamed through the gap, and in the gap, in the blinding white of wind-driven snow, illuminated by the amber light of the lamp behind her, stood Harriet Aldrich. She was barely recognizable. Snow covered her from head to hem, her hat, her shoulders, the front of her coat, her eyebrows and lashes so caked with ice that her face had the fixed, stiff quality of something carved rather than alive. She was holding 2 children against her sides, with both arms, one on each side. A boy and a girl, both smaller than they should have been. In the thickness of their winter clothing, both coated in the same blinding white as their mother, both crying silently with the particular silence of children who have been crying so long they have no sound left. Harriet Aldrich, wife of Raymond Aldrich, the woman who had sat in the parlor of the finest cabin in Harwick and heard her husband say that he did not want orphan trouble in the neighborhood, and who had said nothing. She looked at Celia through the ice on her lashes, and she opened her mouth, and what came out was not words, but the shape of them. Her voice destroyed by cold and wind and whatever she had been through to reach this door. The roof, Celia understood, was what she was trying to say. Something about the roof. She did not wait for the words to form. She reached past. Harriet took the small girl from her left arm, pulled the child inside, reached back, took the boy from her right arm, pulled him inside. Then she took Harriet by the coat front and pulled her inside and put her shoulder to the door and drove it closed against the wind and dropped the crossbar. The roaring reduced to a sustained pressure rather than an immediate assault. The three newcomers stood in the circle of lamplight and stove heat and dripped snow onto the floor and shook the whole body uncontrollable shaking of people who have been very cold for a sustained period and whose muscles are only now realizing that they are allowed to react. Celia was already moving, blankets from the pile she had arranged without knowing why, the kettle on the stove, the lamp turned up to its highest point, her own coat off her own shoulders and around the small girl who was closest. She did not ask what had happened. She could reconstruct it well enough. The finest cabin in Harwick had a wide, flat roof. A flat roof in heavy snow is not a roof. It is a platform for accumulation. And what accumulates on a flat roof in a blizzard does not slide off as it slides off an angled roof, or redirect as wind redirects off a curved wall. It stays. It builds. And it builds until the structure beneath it makes a decision. It cannot take back. She would hear the details later. She was not thinking about the details now. She was thinking about the fire and the water and the small girl's hands, which were the white color. That hands should not be, and the particular angle at which Harriet Aldrich had folded down onto the floor, which was the angle of someone who has used everything they had to get to where they are, and has arrived at the outer edge of what they had. Celia knelt in front of Harriet and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and pressed a warm cup into her hands and held them there until she felt the grip tighten slightly. Not much, but enough. Outside, the blizzard roared on. Inside the curved wooden walls of the silo that everyone had said was not a home, the stove breathed steadily and the lamp burned steadily. And Celia Holt, 18 years old, orphan laundress engineer of no formal credential, moved from one cold person to another in the small circle of warmth she had built out of nothing, and did what she had always done. She kept things alive. The blizzard did not negotiate. That was the thing about it that survivors would talk about for years afterward in the particular way that people talk about experiences that have permanently altered their understanding of what the world is capable of. They would talk about the cold and the wind and the snow that came down not in flakes, but in a continuous horizontal sheet, as if the sky had simply tilted on its side and decided that the distinction between falling and blowing was no longer relevant. But what they would talk about most in the end was the absence of negotiation. There was no lull. There was no pause in which you could catch your breath and reassess. The blizzard of January 1877 came at full force and stayed at full force for 4 days. And during those 4 days, it made no concession to the preferences of the people caught inside it. Inside the silo, Celia made her own decisions. In the first hours after Harriet Aldrich and her children arrived, She worked through a sequence of priorities with the focused calm of someone who has trained herself through months of difficult living to think clearly, when thinking is exactly what the situation requires. Warmth first. She rebuilt the fire to its highest sustainable level, the level at which the stove would put out the maximum heat without burning through the wood supply faster than the circumstances could justify. She redistributed the blankets to account for 3 additional bodies, calculating the balance between keeping the children fully covered and maintaining enough flexibility in the supply to accommodate the possibility which she was already considering, though she had not said it aloud, that more people might arrive. The children warmed faster than their mother. Children she had observed in her years at St. Bridget's have a resilience to the cold that is partly physical and partly something else, a quality of not fully understanding the gravity of what has happened to them, which protects them in ways that adult comprehension does not. The boy, who was perhaps 9, sat up within an hour and accepted the cup of broth Celia made from her small supply of dried beef, and asked in a voice still rough with cold whether the silo made that noise all the time. Celia said yes. He listened to the sustained roar of the wind against the curved walls for a moment. Then he said it sounded like a river, like being inside a riverbank while the water went past outside. She looked at him and thought that was probably the most accurate description she had heard. Harriet took longer. She had been outside longer, and she had been carrying more, not just the physical weight of the children, but the specific weight that descends on a person who makes the decision alone in the dark, in a blizzard that the building they are in is no longer safe, and they must move through the killing cold with their children to find something that is. That kind of weight does not lift quickly. Celia wrapped her in every spare blanket she had pressed, warm cups into her hands at intervals, and said very little because she understood that what Harriet needed was not conversation, but the simple, sustained evidence that she was in a place that would hold. She did not speak to Harriet about Raymond. She did not speak about the room at Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house or the laundry customers or any of the other quiet pressures that had been applied to the edges of her life over the past months. There was no version of that conversation that was appropriate to this moment, and she had no interest in a version that was. The children were warming. Harriet was breathing steadily. The silo was standing. These were the relevant facts. Around midnight, Harriet's grip on her cup had steadied enough that Celia sat back on her heels and looked at her directly and asked what had happened to the roof. Harriet said it had begun making sounds around 7 in the evening. Deep structural sounds, the sounds of timber taking more load than it was designed for. Raymond had gone up to try to clear the snow from the flat surface, which she understood now was not something one man could do in a blizzard, and had come back down covered in ice, saying the accumulation was too deep and moving too fast. The sounds from the roof continued and deepened. At 8:30, a section of the ceiling over the main room had bowed downward 6 inches in the space of a few minutes, and Raymond had told her to take the children and go. She had asked where. He had said the silo. Celia absorbed this for a moment. Raymond Aldrich, in the last functional minutes of the finest cabin in Harwick, had sent his wife and children to the one structure he had spent months trying to acquire, dismiss, and undermine. She filed this information in the same place she kept other facts that were true and important and not yet fully understood. She asked where Raymond was now. Harriet said he had stayed to try to shore up the roof from inside. She had not heard from him. She did not know. Celia added wood to the stove and said nothing more. At 9 o'clock in the morning of January 9th, the wind had not diminished by a single degree of force, but the snow had shifted slightly. Still coming, still horizontal, but with a quality of light in it that was different from the absolute darkness of the night. Celia had not slept. She had kept the fire through the night in 2-hour rotations, adding wood on a schedule she had calculated to last through the storm, adjusting her estimates as the night went on and the storm showed no signs of the moderation she had hoped for. She heard him before she saw him, a sound at the door that was different from Harriet's desperate knocking of the night before. This was slower, heavier, the sound of someone who has very little left but is applying all of it to the task of remaining upright and moving forward. She opened the door. Raymond Aldrich stood in the white. He was not the man she had seen moving through Harwick in the preceding months. The man with the measured step and the careful expression and the air of someone who has surveyed every room he has entered and found it adequately arranged for his purposes. The man at the door was covered from hat to boot in ice and snow, his face the color of old ash, his eyes set in dark hollows that spoke of a night that had required everything he had, and then a portion of something beyond that. His left hand was pressed against his right forearm in a way that suggested the right hand was not fully functional. His breath came in visible bursts through cracked lips. He looked at Celia. She looked at him. She stepped back from the door. She said, "Come inside." He came inside. He did not speak. He moved to the stove with the single-minded directness of something seeking heat, the way a plant seeks light, not as a decision, but as a biological imperative. And he stood in front of it with his hands extended and his eyes half closed. Harriet rose from the floor and went to him, and he put his arms around her, and she said his name once quietly. And then neither of them said anything for a while. Celia gave him the cup she had been holding in her own hands. He took it. His grip was unsteady, but it held. She went to the other side of the blanket partition and sat on the floor with her back against the curved wall and the notebook in her lap. She opened it to the page she had started the evening before, January 8th, 1877. Temperature drop, wind from northwest. And she wrote January 9th morning. R.A. arrived from main cabin. Cabin roof failed overnight. 5 persons now in silo. Fire holding. Wood supply recalculated adequate for 6 days at current rate. She closed the notebook. She sat for a while and listened to the wind against the curved walls and the sound of the stove and the children breathing. She did not think about what Raymond Aldrich had done or not done. She thought about the fire and the wood and the 5 people inside the structure and the storm that was showing no sign of stopping. These were the relevant facts. The rest would sort itself out when the storm was over. On the morning of January 10th, the storm entered its 3rd day. Celia had reorganized the heated interior twice to accommodate the presence of 5 people, and she had done it with the quiet authority of someone who understands that when you are the person who built the space and knows its every dimension and limitation, the management of it falls to you regardless of who else is in it. regardless of their age or standing or the amount of land they own. She assigned positions not by preference, but by thermal logic, children closest to the stove, adults arranged in a circle beyond them, with blankets distributed for maximum coverage, everyone rotating positions every few hours so that no single person was the farthest from the heat for too long. Raymond Aldrich, the most powerful man in Harwick, sat where Celia told him to sit. He did not comment on this. He had come through a night that had rearranged his sense of what mattered in the way that certain experiences are capable of doing permanently to a person who is honest enough to let them. At mid-morning of the 10th, the knock came again. Celia was at the door before the second blow. She had been listening for it. She realized had been listening for it since the storm began, with the part of her mind that was always calculating, always running the numbers, and that had noted, without her consciously acknowledging it, that her silo was not the only structure in the county, and that the storm had been going for 2 full days. She opened the door. Walter Crane stood in the snow, and beside him stood his wife, Ida, a small woman, with a face full of the specific calm that belongs to people who have been through enough difficulty to know that panic is the least useful response to it. Walter was carrying something under his arm, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the snow. He said, "Cabin's pulling off the foundation. East corner first, then the north wall started going an hour ago." He looked past her at the interior, at the 5 people arranged around the stove. The blankets, the lamp, the organized economy of a small space that had been made to do more than it was originally asked to do. He said, "Room for 2 more." Celia stepped back from the door. They came in. Ida went directly to the children and settled beside them with the efficient warmth of a woman who has spent a lifetime knowing what children need without being asked. Walter closed the door and stood in the center of the floor and looked at the ceiling, the wall, the iron rings, the stovepipe, the blanket partition, the careful arrangement of people and resources that Celia had built and managed through 2 days of the worst storm in Dakota memory. He unwrapped the oilcloth package. Inside it was a flat board covered in pencil lines, a drawing carefully rendered of the silo's exterior and interior structure. He had been working on it, Celia understood, since his visit in December. He had drawn the iron ring positions, the wall thickness, the circumference, the roof angle. He had noted in his careful carpenter's hand the specifications that made the structure what it was. He held it out to her. He said, "I started this in December, after I saw how the November snow treated the neighborhood. I've been adding to it." He looked at the drawing and then at her. "After this storm, people in this county are going to want to know how to build something that doesn't fall. This is how you show them." Celia took the board. She looked at the drawing for a long moment, the careful lines representing the structure she had lived inside for 4 months, the structure she had sealed and tended, and learned the language of the structure that was at this moment holding 7 people against a storm that had destroyed or damaged 30 structures in the surrounding miles. She said, "I've been writing down what I observed, about how it handles the wind and the weight of snow on the roof and the heat distribution." Walter looked at her steadily. He said, "Then between your observations and my drawings, we have something worth keeping." He sat down on the floor across from Raymond Aldrich, 2 men who moved in very different circles of Harwick's social geography, brought to the same square footage of silo floor by the same democratic force of a blizzard that had not consulted anyone standing before it arrived. Neither of them said anything for a while. The storm roared outside. The stove breathed. The 7 people inside the curved wooden walls of an abandoned grain silo sat in the warmth that Celia had built and maintained, and they waited for the storm to finish saying what it had to say. The blizzard broke on the morning of January 12th. It did not end gradually. It ended the way it had begun, decisively, without ceremony. Celia woke in the gray early light to a silence that was different from the terrible silence of January 8th. That silence had been pressurized, held. This silence was the silence of something spent. The roaring that had been continuous for 4 days was gone, and in its absence the world sounded the way a room sounds after a long argument, exhausted and strangely peaceful. She climbed to the loft and opened the small vent in the upper wall that she used for air circulation and looked out at the world. It was white in every direction, white to the horizon, the kind of white that has no gradations, no shadows, no relief. Snowdrifts had built against every vertical surface, some of them 5 and 6 feet deep, sculpted by the continuous wind into shapes that looked deliberate, like the work of some enormous and careless hand. The sky overhead was the pale, washed blue of winter mornings after storms, clean, transparent, offering nothing but light. She could see from the elevated angle of the vent the roof lines of several structures in the direction of Harwick. Some of them were not there anymore. The Cutter cabin she could see directly, or rather, she could see what was left of it, which was the walls minus the roof, standing like a frame for something that no longer existed. A barn further out was flattened entirely, a pile of boards that the drifted snow had already begun to make geometric. She could also see the silo's roof. It was missing perhaps 6 shingles along the northeast edge. The rest was intact. She climbed down and looked at the 7 people sleeping around the stove in the gray morning light. Ida Crane had the 2 children tucked against her on either side. Harriet Aldrich was asleep, sitting upright with her back against the south wall. Raymond Aldrich was asleep on his side near the stove with his coat folded under his head as a pillow. Walter Crane sat with his back against the northwest wall. His head drooped onto his chest, his hands resting on his knees. Celia stood in the middle of the floor and looked at all of them. She looked at the stove that still had enough wood to last the morning. She looked at the walls that had not moved. She looked at the floor that Thomas had built 6 inches above the cold ground, that Henrik had leveled and nailed with the cheerful precision of a man who takes pride in things being exactly right. She looked at the iron rings in the wall, the ones set by a German settler named Wilhelm Frisch in 1859, who had known something about wind that most people in Dakota Territory were still learning. She built up the fire. She put the kettle on, and she waited for the 7 people sleeping in her home to wake up and discover what the storm had decided. Raymond Aldrich was the 3rd one awake. His children woke first, as children always do, with the immediate, uncomplicated energy of people who have slept well and are ready for the next thing, regardless of what the previous thing was. Then Ida Crane, who woke the way experienced women wake fully, and at once taking immediate stock of her surroundings and the people in them, and what each of them needed. Raymond woke more slowly. He lay still for a moment after his eyes opened, looking at the curved ceiling of the silo above him. And in that moment, before the full consciousness of his situation assembled itself, His face had an expression that Celia saw and did not look away from. It was the expression of a man who is lying in a place he did not expect to be processing a night that he did not expect to have, beginning to understand something that he did not expect to understand. Then, he was fully awake and the expression was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality he habitually wore. But she had seen it. She thought Walter Crane had seen it too. By mid-morning, all 7 of them were awake and fed, and the first shock of the storm's end had settled into the quieter, more complicated business of understanding what had happened. Raymond and Walter shoveled the door clear together. The drift against the south face of the silo was 4 feet deep. Working in silence side by side with the particular wordless cooperation of 2 people who are focused on a physical task and not yet ready to have any other kind of conversation. Harriet sat with her children and Ida near the stove, and Celia listened to the 3 women talk about what each of them had heard in the night from inside their different shelters. The sounds of the storm arriving, the sounds of things failing or holding the moments of decision that had sent each of them in a particular direction through the killing cold. Ida described the north wall of their cabin beginning to pull away from the foundation with a sound she said she would never forget. Not a crack or a snap, but a long, slow groan, the sound of something that had been holding on, giving up. Harriet said the roof of the Aldrich cabin had sounded like a crowd of people walking above them, getting heavier and heavier. And then one section had simply come down. She looked at Celia when she said this with an expression that was asking something it was not yet ready to ask in words. Celia said, "The snow slides off this roof. The angle doesn't let it sit." Harriet looked at the ceiling. She nodded slowly. The nod of someone absorbing information that is also something else, a concession, an acknowledgement of something she was not previously willing to see. That afternoon, when the snow had been shoveled sufficiently to allow movement, they began to go back. Walter and Ida Crane went first to assess the damage to their cabin and determine what was salvageable. Walter stopped at the door and turned to Celia and said, "I'll be back in 2 days with the completed drawing. And I want to see that notebook." She said he would. He went out into the white and she watched his broad shoulders moving through the drifts until the distance made him small. Raymond Aldrich was last to leave. He got his children dressed in their layers and Harriet in her coat, and he oversaw the process with the focused attention of a man making sure everything is correctly managed, which she understood was how he processed most situations, and probably always would be. When they were ready, he sent Harriet and the children out first, and then stood at the open door with his hand on the frame. He looked back at Celia. She was standing at the middle of the floor, where she always stood when she was thinking, at the center of the cylinder, equidistant from every curved wall in the place where the space felt most like what it was. Raymond Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. The morning light came in cold and clear through the open door and illuminated the interior of the silo, the stove, the blankets, the notebook on the shelf beside the Bible, the iron rings in the wall, the floor that Thomas had built 6 inches above the cold ground. He said, "I owe you an explanation." She said, "You owe me a room at Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house." She said it quietly, without heat, the way you state a fact, the way Thomas stated facts. Raymond looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite any single identifiable emotion, but was several of them arriving in sequence too quickly to separate. He said, "Yes, I do." He said nothing else for a moment. Then he said, "The timber. I won't pursue it. The silo stands." She looked at him. She said, "I know it stands. It stood through 4 days of the worst blizzard in Dakota memory. The question of whether it stands was settled before you arrived." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once with the specific quality of a man who is acknowledging something larger than a single transaction, something that will require more time to fully articulate than a doorway conversation allows. He walked out into the snow. Celia stood at the door and watched the Aldrich family move through the white landscape toward what remained of their home. And she felt not triumph, not vindication, not any of the hot emotions that the situation might have been expected to produce. She felt something quieter, something that was closer to the feeling she had sitting in the silo the first night when the freedom had been almost indistinguishable from loss, except further along past the loss, past the fear, past the long dark months of building and maintaining and refusing to stop. What she felt was the particular peace of someone who has been tested by the largest thing available and has discovered without any longer having to wonder exactly what they are made of. She went back inside and added wood to the stove and picked up the notebook. She opened it to the page that said, January 8th, 1877, and she added the final line of that entry, January 12th. Storm ended. Silo standing. 7 people out. She underlined it once. Then she closed the notebook. On January 13th, Harwick counted its damage. It counted in the practical way of frontier communities, which is to say that people went to each other's properties and looked at what was there and what was not, and they wrote it down. Because writing it down is the first step toward understanding what needs to be done next. 12 cabins had collapsed entirely. 18 more had sustained damage that ranged from severe to merely significant. 4 barns were gone. 1 rancher had lost 30 head of cattle that had frozen where they stood in a pasture. They could not leave because the drifts had sealed the fence line. 2 people in the broader region had died of exposure. A man caught traveling between towns when the storm hit, and an elderly woman whose cabin had lost its roof in the first hours, and who had not been able to reach any shelter before the cold took her. 2 people, against the number who might have died if the structures around them had been differently built. If the choices they had made in the critical hours of the storm's arrival had been different. If a certain 18-year-old girl had not spent 4 months learning to read a building that everyone else had dismissed as a curiosity. 7 people had come out of the silo alive. The community gathered as communities do after disasters in the informal way that does not require an announcement. People simply began appearing in the same places, needing to see each other, and to be seen needing the confirmation that the person they are looking at is still there and recognizable. They gathered in the street near the hardware store and near the dry goods counter, and near the spot where the Cutter cabin's wall stood roofless in the bright January cold. Sarah Nell Garrett was one of the first people to say it publicly. She had been saying things publicly for 20 years and had developed a reputation for it that freed her from the obligation of building up to them. She stood in the street and said that the orphan girl's round silo had outlasted every flat-walled, flat-roofed, standard-built structure in the storm's path. and that anyone who had spent the previous months laughing about it was going to need to think carefully about what exactly they had been laughing at. No one argued with her. Then Raymond Aldrich walked into the street from the direction of his property, where the crew he had already hired was beginning the work of removing what was left of the finest cabin in Harwick. And he stood where people could see him, and he spoke. He did not speak loudly. He never did. He spoke with the precise, measured cadence of a man who has decided that what he is about to say is the most important thing he will say today, and who is giving it the weight it deserves. He said that he had spent 4 days in a grain silo that he had tried to acquire and demolish. He said that the silo had housed 7 people through the worst winter storm in 40 years without a single structural failure. He said that the woman who lived in it had managed those 7 people, their warmth, their food, their safety, with a competence that he had not observed in many men of twice her age and experience. He said that he had made decisions in the months preceding the storm that had worked against her ability to establish herself in Harwick, and that those decisions had been wrong, and that he was saying so publicly because public wrongs require public acknowledgement. He paused. The street was very quiet. He said, "She built the only thing that held. I think we should consider what that means about everything else she built." He stopped speaking and stood in the cold with his hands at his sides, and the street was quiet for a moment longer. And then it wasn't quiet anymore, because Walter Crane started speaking about the drawing he had made and the notebook Celia kept, and someone asked what a notebook had to do with it. And Walter explained in the patient and precise way of a man who has been building things for 40 years and has finally found a student worth teaching what it means to observe a structure, under load, and record what you see. And people listened. They listened the way people listen when they have just been through something large enough to make them genuinely interested in understanding it. Celia was not in the street when Raymond Aldrich spoke. She was at the silo replacing the 6 missing shingles on the northeast edge of the roof, working from the ladder she had borrowed from the hardware store. Her breath visible in the cold air, the hammer steady in her hand. She had heard secondhand what was said from Nell Garrett, who walked out along the east track to tell her in person, because she felt that certain information should not arrive in fragments. She listened to what Nell told her, and then she went back to the shingle she was setting and drove 3 nails into it, and moved to the next one. Nell watched her work for a moment and said, "You're not going to say anything," Celia said. "The roof needs to be solid before the next snow." Nell was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're a practical woman, Celia Holt." Celia said, "I learned from practical people." She thought of Sister Marin, who had taught her that the changing sky is not decorative. She thought of